Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we'll be reviewing the Sao Silvestre Anaerobic Processed Brazil from Jacu Coffee Roastery. And there's the bag right there. And Jacu, based out of Ålesund, Norway. And this is part one of our 4-part series featuring the Right Roast June subscription box. And Jacu is a coffee roaster that has appeared on this channel multiple times before, exclusively as part of our Cafe Box Advent Calendar series. And up to this point, we've had mostly mixed reviews due to the fact that a lot of the coffees we've reviewed from them have been more heavily processed coffees. That being said, their Key Washed Kenya turned out to be one of our favorite coffees from the entirety of last year's Advent Calendar. So I definitely wanted to go back and review a full bag of their coffee. So we will see how this one turned out, as this right here is day 36. And recipe we went with for this coffee was a recipe we found for Jacu, which was a 15.5 to 1 water to coffee ratio, brewed at 93 degrees Celsius, about 200 degrees Fahrenheit. I like this one best through the V60, which indicates a more medium fine grind. Roast profile for this coffee, as I always say, it's a little bit more tricky to tell when it comes to these heavier processed coffees. That being said, our previous experiences with Jacu has been on the lighter side of things. Maybe not quite as light as some of the other Nordic-based coffee roasters, but still lighter by most standards and metrics. This one did feel like it had a slight bit more development to it, and that could be attributed to the processing method on this coffee. So I think it's maybe safest to say a little bit more developed side of a light in terms of this roast profile. With that out of the way, let's go ahead and start discussing this coffee. Day 14, first impression. Ran it through the Chemex, and there was definitely a fermenty aroma to the brew, but it wasn't quite as heavy in the cup itself as expected, as there was a slight bit of fermentiness, but it felt a little bit more dialed back in place of some bright and fruit-forward aspects as opposed to that fermenty aspect. The cup does cool down and settle off into a little bit more of the fermentiness, but other than that, it was initially a little bit more tropical forward, giving it a better than expected first impression. We continue on to day 17. Ran it through the V60, and the cup does offer a slight bit more clarity than expected. It skews a little bit more in the direction of the listed stone fruit as opposed to anything else, with a slight bit of a grainy and fermenty aspect coming through at the end. Otherwise, it was a little bit more pleasant of a cup, offering a fruit-forward aspect, initially clean, then layered, and pretty vibrant in general. So a nice first couple of days relative to the expectations. We continue on to day 19, ran it through the April brewer, and it was much more in line with the listed cacao nib notes that they do have on here, as it felt like there was a lot more of a chocolate-forward cup than any of the previous days, with a slightly earthy chocolate base dominating the cup. In addition to that, there was a little less structure, resulting in a bit more undefined of a brightness, and it immediately transitioned into plenty of that earthy chocolate base. Less graininess, but also less focus, so not quite as good. It didn't enjoy it as much through this brew method. We continue on to day 22, back through the V60 with Jacu's recipe, and it did seem to help the coffee, as it was reminiscent of our previous day 14 experience with slightly more clarity relative to a lot of other anaerobic coffees. Plenty of brightness in line with the listed red apple, and a little bit more of those cacao nibs in the finish, with plenty of the lingering tropicality. Best day up to this point. We continue on to day 25, same adjustments through the Chemex, and it's the most fermenty it had been up to this point. And so at this moment, I decided we were going to persist with the V60 going forward, as this seems to offer so many of the heavy aspects, taking away from the previously mentioned fruit components to this one. Very heavy in the chocolate as well, so not anything I necessarily enjoyed about this day. Continue on to day 29 and back through the V60 with Jacu's recipe. And this is the best I'd experienced from this coffee. It improved again on this day, as it was a bit more in line with that day 14 experience, but a much more toned down version of this coffee with a little bit more of a focus on the tropical sweetness. In addition to that, there was a slight fermenty mango aspect, but it was better balanced in general, with a notable brightness in line with the listed apple yet again. In addition to that, the cacao nibs felt a little bit more toned down, so having a lot of the more heavy and fermenty aspects being toned down in place of a fruit tropicality was definitely a selling point to me. Day 32, final notes that we do have, and it's because we actually ran out of space, but same as the previous day, with the cup offering an intensifying aspect to it. A lot of the fermentiness just continued to increase, so I feel like it was one of those things where it was naturally increasing with a little bit of time, as there was a little bit more of an undefined brightness yet again, Very high level of sweetness. Cacao nibs a bit more at the forefront today. The previously mentioned apple brightness and a slightly more undefined tropical citric aspect now. So not quite necessarily as good as that previous day, but even then it's an improvement on some of the earlier days we had had of this coffee. All right, let's go ahead and put up the tasting wheel so you can see what we're getting. And we have 3 level 5s, so let's go through those real quick. We'll start with the finish. Level 5, yes, it is a very long-lasting coffee, and that's not surprising in any sense. It is an anaerobic processed coffee, and usually I reserve that long-lasting finish for these types of coffees. And this one right here definitely has that in significant abundance, as there's a fair bit of the heaviness, fair bit of the fermentiness present within this one. So not too surprising that that finished on level 5, right in line with the sweetness also being very high at the level 5. I mentioned briefly that this was a very sweet cup of coffee, and again, it's that kind of overbearing sweet finish to the cup. So not necessarily my type of thing. I typically don't enjoy this within coffee, so both of those things feel justified at that level 5 mark. Acidity, level 5. Yes, I think I was kind of surprised by just how much brightness there was present within this one. And at times it did feel a little undefined, but even now on this day, you can just feel so much of that, even trying to tone this coffee down. So yes, that's another thing that I wasn't necessarily the biggest fan of when it came to this one. All 3 of those things, a little bit overbearing and a little too heavy for me. Now we have a bunch of level 3s. We'll start with the berry fruit. Level 3, yes, there's a slightly tropical berry aspect that's present within this one. And it's a little more robust, a little bit more heavy. I don't think any part of that is surprising. In addition to that, we have the citrus fruit, level 4. A lot of these things, I think I'm kind of surprised maybe they didn't reach an even higher mark, but given that you were able to experience a fair bit of them in significant abundance for the entirety of this coffee, then maybe it shouldn't be too surprising that none of them reached level 4, given that you got at least a little bit of all of them throughout. Citrus, as I kind of mentioned, a little bit more prominent towards the end, and I could say it was a little bit more in line with something like a pineapple yet again. Stone fruit, level 4. Yes, that's one of the things that was maybe a little bit more defined within this coffee, and that was that slightly fermenting mango aspect that was present for a lot of this one. So that definitely feels justified at that level 4. Chocolate, level 4. Yes, that part I don't think is too surprising. They do have those cacao nibbles listed on here, and those were quite heavy, a little bit more heavy than I might have hoped for or expected. But, well, actually I should say that I did kind of expect that given what the processing method is and what the origin of this coffee is. Body, level 4. Yes, surprisingly, a lot of texture within this one. Again, I really needed to maybe align my expectations with this one to be a little bit more reminiscent of a lot of coffees I've had similar to this one. So the body, it had a lot of texture, really strong high body on this one. So that's also at that level 4. Then we have a lot of level 3s. So florality level 3, yes, with all of the really strong factors that were present within this one, I was still able to feel a slight bit of a fermenting, correction, a floral aspect in this. In addition to that, a spice-like component to it. It wasn't necessarily an overly positive sense of either of those two things. So yeah, they were quite present. The bitterness, level 3, yes, once again, that very strong citric aspect at times also did feel a little bitter. And then the savory aspect, yes, there was a very strong herbal component that was present within this one. I mean, this does look like a anaerobic coffee tasting wheel where you just have really strong and high marks on a lot of this tasting wheel in general. But then, of course, the most important thing comes in terms of the cleanliness, level 2. Yes, I couldn't push that up any higher. A lot of this coffee did feel a little undefined at times. That's why it's a little bit more tricky to describe this one. A lot of heavy, a lot of fermenty aspects present, especially from kind of that second cup going forward. The second cup was one of the better and cleaner cups of coffee. But I kept saying at the start that it was a little bit more clean than initially expected when it came to these sorts of coffees. That being said, it wasn't a particularly overly clean coffee to begin with. A lot of those heavier aspects just persistent and present throughout. So it didn't feel like it deserved anything higher than level 2, even if it was slightly more clean than a lot of the other coffees that we've had in the same mold. So looking at this tasting wheel, honestly, I think it's a pretty good representation of what I was getting from this coffee. All right, so my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee. I guess it does say a fair bit that even when I do have a full bag to work with for these types of coffees from Jacu, then I still kind of feel the same way about the singular samples that I do have from them. They're just not necessarily my favorites. It's pretty well documented and well known at this point that these types of coffees aren't my favorite, mostly just the fact that they can come out a little bit too heavy and overbearing. That's definitely the case as this tasting wheel displayed, with so many of the really strong components being at that overbearing, too heavy mark for me. and it seems to lack the same sort of clarity that I am looking for in coffee in general. I've said before that I want my coffees to be at minimum level 4 in terms of the clarity, and it's very rare that we do get any of these heavier processed coffees reaching that mark, as they just seem to be muddied by a lot of some really strong flavor profiles skewing very heavily in directions that I'm not necessarily the biggest fan of. So no surprise that this one wasn't necessarily my favorite, but that does transition into the type of person I would suggest this coffee to. Anybody that does still like these much more heavy processed coffees in general. This one did have some bright spots to it, as it did offer an abundance of fruit qualities to it, without skewing too strong in one particular direction. Yeah, the sweetness and the finish were maybe a little bit more heavy and dominant than I might have expected, but it did offer some great brightness for people that really enjoy that strong, bright aspects that's present within these coffees. In addition to that, a lot of those other fruit components, all 3 of them reached a level 4 mark, so you're able to get a fair bit of different fruit components within this, as well as some really strong herbal chocolate aspect that was also present within this coffee. So that does lead to a very, well, we'll say strong flavor profile sort of coffee drinker. For the most part though, I'll leave this review at that. If you by chance had an opportunity to try this coffee, I'd love to know your thoughts or impressions of it as well. If you're enjoying the content, give this video a like, subscribe if you're not already subscribed. But this right here has been a review of the Sao Silvestre Anaerobic Processed Brazil from Jacu Coffee Roastery. Thank you for watching.